hard not to be captivated by what is going on in the Middle East. While the rest of the world is trying to get through the recession, the Middle East is leading the way with driving technology innovation and spend. The challenge we face, though, is how do you keep up with the almost daily press releases coming out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE on topics like artificial intelligence, large language models like ChatGPT, autonomous vehicles, and the metaverse, just to name a few. The good news is that I have found someone who spends a large portion of his week tracking all these announcements so we don't have to. And he's today's guest on the Tech Burst Asia podcast. We're going to speak with Carrington Malin, the person behind the Middle East AI News, to get the latest on the hot topics that are driving the Middle East technology and innovation sectors. Carrington, welcome to the Tech Burst Asia podcast.
Charles, thanks very much for having me on. I've been a big fan of Tech Burst for a long time, and so it's great to finally be part of your show.
I'm loving the concept of this because normally I focus on Asia, but when I wanted to tap into the Middle East, you're the perfect person to know what's going on with the Middle East innovation ecosystem. And I should also welcome Daniel to the show because Daniel's going to co-host this series with me. So Daniel, how's everything going today?
Everything is going fantastic. And thanks for having me, Charles. It's great. I'm a big fan as well, as you know, and I'm very excited to co-host the series on Middle East and happy to speak with you today, Carrington. Look forward to it.
Good, me too. Thanks, Daniel.
All right, so let's kick it off. So Carrington, why don't you start off by telling us a bit about yourself and the role you've been playing in the Middle East innovation ecosystem for quite some time?
Yes, quite some time indeed. I've been working in the Middle East tech sector for about 30 years now. In fact, from the time the likes of Intel and Microsoft and Cisco first set up their operations in the region. And my background's sales and marketing. So I originally moved to Dubai to work with the Dubai World Trade Center, selling exhibition space. And by the time I left, I was running JITEX, and that had become the Middle East's biggest technology trade show. And then when I left to set up my own communications agency in the 90s, also in Dubai, I decided to specialize in tech and telecom. And because I'd already got a lot of those relationships with the industry, I started with Intel as my first client. Running that agency for 20 years, we helped dozens of global tech firms establish themselves in the region, build out their channel systems, introduce new technologies, pretty much from introducing the internet virtually. We also worked with regional and global telecom firms during that period in the Middle East where we had the deregulation at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. And then, of course, Twitter and Facebook came along and changed the internet. And that led us into doing a lot more digital work and working with digital services. And so I've been focused on tech for quite a long time. But actually, when I wound down the agency a few years ago, I'd fallen out of love with tech and wasn't really dealing with many tech firms and was focusing more on retail and other B2B and government. And I found myself at a sort of bit of a loose end because I had no firm plan of what I was going to do. So I went out starting talking to people and getting ideas and finding out where they were up to. And I just got pulled into some very interesting conversations about extended reality, blockchain, cloud apps, and of course, artificial intelligence. And I figured out pretty quickly that AI was where I should be focusing on next. And the sheer growth that AI and technologies powered by AI was going to have in the future was going to create a lot of opportunity. And so I began reading up as much as I could and networking as much as I could to find out more about AI ventures, the investment going into the sector, the things that were coming up. And this was now about 2018, 2019. Of course, many of these AI ventures and AI investments, that news is coming out of China and Southeast Asia. I decided to try and externalize it by starting an Asia AI newsletter. And I think, Charles, you were actually one of my first readers. And I ran that until, I think, 2021. But in 2020, I decided actually the Middle East was also getting very interesting now from that point of view and started a newsletter called Middle East AI News, early 2020. So reluctantly, I had to stop the Asia newsletter because running two newsletters was just too much of an overhead on my time. But in the meantime, of course, in the past few years, we've seen the UAE and Saudi accelerate massively innovation programs that focus on AI, the investment going into AI supported sectors and technologies. And so today I'm focused on AI and other emerging tech. I work with global firms that are in the region or moving into the region. I also work with a few startups and scale up that are telling new technologies. And occasionally I get to work with partners on big digital and tech initiatives in the region. And it's very interesting. I'm sitting now in one of the most innovative regions in the world, where governments are really leading the way in many respects when it comes to embracing new technologies, investing, making plans and policies for AI. And Saudi is a very good example of this. The whole Saudi business industrial sector has really been following the government digital transformation efforts and plans, and it's really worked. And there's just a sea change in how government and private companies are approaching digitalization and using these technologies. And this pace is incredible. And most of this, as I tell people that are visiting the region, is just a few years old. And it's a common misconception, people coming to visit the UAE and Saudi Arabia and get the impression, oh, this is what it's like. And the truth is, this is what it's like now. 5 years ago, it wasn't exactly like this. An awful lot had happened in the last 5 years. I think one of the pivotal moments for me was last year. His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan had just become president of the UAE, and his first address, talking about society and the plans for the future and the economy, that was the first time I've heard any Gulf leader put technology at number one on their economic agenda. And that was a real moment for everybody in the tech sector here, because you thought, yeah, now we really believe this, that this is now, and we never would have thought that we would have got there.
Carrington, that's you. So you've been in the region a long time, and I've only been here 10% of that. So I came here 3 years ago. But what's interesting is I came when everything was shooting up in terms of AI. And when we were having a chat last week on the other podcast where we were looking at some of the trends in the region, there was a specific topic around how Saudi and UAE, from a government standpoint, are so focused in terms of driving that vision, the growth, and the funding that is needed towards the private sector. So could you talk a little bit about how you see the Saudi market in comparison to UAE in the last few years? What are the key initiatives the government is driving there that you see are probably really focused on driving the awareness, but also the adoption as much as possible in Saudi? And it's interesting you mentioned GITEX. In comparison to now, Saudi has initiated a big event as well, which is LEAP, which is very interesting because I've been there 2 years in a row. And it's fascinating to see how much is going on at LEAP as well. So share a bit more about Saudi. How do you see it, the overall push?
Yeah, well, first off, I think it's worth noting that in common with many other places in the world, we've been very used to seeing governments announce big initiatives and grand plans of how everything's going to change. And they don't always work out. They don't always come through. And there's always a gap there between the initial plan and announcement and the reality of actually what follows. And I think the thing that's blown a lot of people away in the sector here in Saudi and the UAE especially is that these recent announcements focused on innovation and tech, digital transformation, R&D, are announcements that have been followed by a plan with lots of follow-up, with action taken across industry, society, government, education, and on a scale and sophistication that we've never seen before in this region. Now, the second is that obviously the UAE and Saudi Arabia are completely different countries in so many respects, in terms of culture, in terms of size, in terms of population, in terms of economy, and there's limited value in direct comparisons between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And I think for a lot of these recent innovation and tech initiatives, the UAE has picked up faster, and these initiatives have got traction sooner. But when you consider the size of Saudi Arabia and the population, which I think is now at 28 million, it's understandable that things take a little bit longer. But on the other hand, they've got a huge amount of funding behind investment. They have a big population, which obviously gives them huge amounts of data that one, take a lot of time to structure and organize, and two, will continue to bring them enormous benefits when they actually get to realize the benefits of that data. So I think Saudi Arabia is now doing things that we never expected Saudi Arabia to do. And obviously on the social front and the political front, there's a lot of changes there, and women being allowed to drive, and the dropping of segregation across a lot of places in Saudi Arabia, and the plans for tourism, all of those things. On the tech front, it's really the government drive on digital transformation and looking for all the pieces of the puzzle that they will need to create an economy that's driven by new tech and industries that are supported by AI and other emerging tech. And both the UAE and Saudi are doing this in quite a systematic way, where they're not simply looking at the project and the funding for this project, perhaps be for one government department or be a cross-government department. They're looking also at the ecosystem of what partners will be there to work with and how that sector of the economy will grow, where the talent will come from, and how much of that talent will be homegrown and home developed. And then where will that talent get its skills, and in what areas strategically does Saudi Arabia need to have people working in cybersecurity, coding, AI, data, and all of these different facets of AI and data in the new economy. That, I think, is the most impressive thing that is being done at the moment, that these countries, and Saudi Arabia is one, are looking at all of those pieces and how they come together. So in Saudi, there's a raft of government initiatives that have been put together to improve government efficiency, introduce technologies, and organize the data across all government departments. And I think Saudi's now got the biggest government data cloud in the region. It had extensive programs going through all of its government departments to organize that data, to make it accessible for other government departments, and also to embrace AI and these new technologies. And alongside that, there's been training of executives and digital and IT personnel in government departments. There's also been education and training initiatives that have gone wider down to school level, where they have a summer camp that has thousands of participants learning about how to use new technologies, how to code, learning about AI, cybersecurity, many other things, because they want that pipeline of talent to make sure that they're not going to stall and that these developments keep going on. The Saudi is hugely impressive.
This is one of the things I'm really enjoying about watching the region, because we know that the spend is just going up through the roof when it comes to things around artificial intelligence. And I saw a stat recently that the Middle East is the fastest growth for artificial intelligence, growing at like a 30% annually between 2022 and 2026. So the countries might be small from a population perspective, but the amount of growth is fantastic. That means you're bringing in a lot more vendors. But the challenge the Middle East has always had is they end up having to import talent to support this. And a lot of these new initiatives are all built around trying to get that homegrown talent. And I also noticed in your newsletter last week that Deloitte's now launching an AI institute in Saudi Arabia as well. So it's not just the governments that are doing it, but the private sector is coming in there and saying, actually, this is a growth region. This is going to be very innovative, and we're going to invest here as well to help build it up.
True. It's difficult to keep up. I'm not sure I could even name or tell you the number of AI centers of excellence and AI labs that have been set up in Saudi Arabia during the last 2 years. There's so many on a local level with the government authorities, with global multinationals coming in as partnerships. They're being set up all the time. And this is partly because the government has the focus on making sure that its people are ready and making sure that this talent pipeline continues. If you look at the future talent requirement of the UAE, and particularly Saudi, because of the size of the country and the number of people and the size of the industrial sectors, you look at the requirement in the future for that talent and the usage of AI and data. Now, obviously, AI and data gives you analytics, and that gives you predictive capability that gives you capability to plan better, to respond better as an organization. But then you also have Saudi Arabia is investing heavily in bringing their industrial sector up to Industry 4.0 standard and bringing in new high-tech industries that are also intensive users of AI and emerging tech. It aims to localize 50% of its defense requirement by encouraging local production in Saudi. And of course, the new military technologies that you have are again heavily reliant on AI and other emerging tech and need a specialized workforce to work with them. And they've been creating new projects locally and in partnerships with global players from east and west all over the world. And at the end of the day, they will need people to work in those facilities. They will need people to work in that sector. So yeah, there's a huge amount that's going to be done on both the investment side and also on the talent side.
So Carrington, that's quite fascinating, right? And maybe bringing it in closer to the UAE as well and talking about what's happening when it comes to large language models and ChatGPT. It wouldn't be a podcast if we didn't talk about that.
We love our buzzwords.
Yes.
So I haven't said digital twin or industrial metaverse yet, Charles.
No.
As soon as you say industrial metaverse, I'm going to verb. That verb just drives me up a wall.
What do you think? I'm observing a lot happening on the large language models here as well. Of course, Abu Dhabi has been leading quite a bit on this Technology Innovation Institute. We're also seeing various private startups here talking about large language models. So between UAE, Saudi Arabia, maybe staying more close to UAE, what are you seeing on large language models? What are the interesting use cases that you're potentially seeing as well?
So we've seen big LLM announcements from Abu Dhabi in the last couple of months. If I could just take a small step back, because these big announcements from Abu Dhabi have come by virtue of the fact that Abu Dhabi has been investing heavily in its R&D ecosystem for the last few years, and principally the last 5 years, where we've seen a large growth in the number of labs that are developing AI models and solutions. A lot of different other labs that are interdependent on AI technology, like cybersecurity and other types of digital R&D. Saudi's been doing the same and building up its capacity to develop research in computational sciences. And I'd say for Abu Dhabi, from my experience, we've gone from perhaps dozens or low hundreds of researchers and machine learning engineers in Abu Dhabi, say 5 years ago, to probably in the thousands today. So that's quite a step up. One of the key players is obviously the Technology Innovation Institute in Abu Dhabi, TII, where we've seen several large language model announcements from in the last couple of months. In March, they announced the Falcon large language model. And this is interesting because not everybody expected an announcement of a significant high-performance LLM coming from the UAE to start with, because ChatGPT was only last November. So this is fairly recent, but it's actually something that TII have been working on for almost 2 years. So that development and that research is going on in the background. And when they announced the LLM in March, it came with several quite useful distinctions from, say, OpenAI's ChatGPT. Obviously, it's been developed in the UAE. And so the developers of that technology, the people who've put it together and researched it and have that expertise are based in the UAE in our research and ecosystem, which has meaning for others working in the R&D ecosystem here and also for people that they deal with, like government departments, startups, etc. It's also useful because we've got technology that was developed in the UAE that could be used on an on-premise solution for using LLM. So if you're a government department that doesn't want to have your data exposed to global models and have data go out of country, and you want to have that LLM on premise, then you're able to do that with TII's Falcon. And for a research institute that's less than 3 years old, that's a huge milestone. So This was the first announcement in March when they announced they had the model, which is this 40 billion parameter LLM. And what we've seen in the past week, firstly, at the beginning of the week, we had an announcement from Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence, releasing 3 ChatGPT models for different vertical uses that they've been developing, and with hints that there will be other ChatGPT models to follow. And these were released as open source. They're published on GitHub, so people can try them out and use them to create solutions. And so that was pretty big news. And then later in the week, of course, we have Technology Innovation Institute and its parent organization, which is the R&D policymaker and regulator in Abu Dhabi, announced that the Falcom 40 billion parameter LLM was going to be made open source. And not only that, but they've called for submissions from researchers and developers to, if anybody has a use case to get accepted by PII, then they'll support it and they'll give them access to compute, and they may help them commercialize that solution that they built. So there's an awful lot going on there. Again, look at this from another perspective, and the UAE's embracing of AI and the building into government plans and policies and its vision for the economy. All of the government departments in the UAE are pro-AI. They all have innovation of some respect going on, looking to see how they can use data, how they can use AI with collaborations with other departments and institutions, with collaboration with global vendors and local developers. And that's already there. So when ChatGPT came along last year, it wasn't long before government departments, and in particular the department responsible for AI across federal government, to look at how they could use this technology for government. A few weeks ago, the government AI office released a document to guide users of ChatGPT in government departments, which is quite incredible. And this, again, is a few months after the technologies actually come into the public sphere. It's indicative of the way that the government's thinking, because they want to try new stuff. They want to have innovation embedded in the way that they grow and develop and improve government. And so they consider this to be another tool that they can use, and they're using it. So lots of opportunities, a significant amount of investment, local IP. Very exciting time, very exciting time.
I'm truly fascinated when I look at the Middle East to see how any of these tech buzzwords that we look at, they're just literally running with it. But it isn't just the idea of making an announcement. They're setting up, how do you actually educate people on how to build the technology or leverage it or deploy it? They're basically coming up with new use cases they could be deploying as well. They're funding it with investment, but also they're doing a lot on the regulation side to make sure that these things are going to be monitored. And I saw an article this week where the UAE is basically calling for world leaders to get together and governments to get together to come up with some kind of policies to regulate AI and the use of AI going forward, which I think is needed. A few years ago, you didn't hear much out of the Middle East, and now it's at the forefront and really driving innovation. And this is going to be my next segue, because it's one of my favorite topics to look at in the UAE. They're pushing the regulations and the boundaries and everything, including self-driving taxis, which should be coming out very soon, and flying taxis. So I'd love to get your take on what is going on with the autonomous vehicle market in the Middle East and in Dubai in particular, because that's where some of the most interesting innovations happening.
Firstly, you're bang on the money. We completely changed the way that policies develop in the UAE, and it's fascinating to watch. And this is obviously at least partly driven by the fact that they're looking at all of these new technologies and autonomous vehicles, flying taxis, all of the attention grabbing topics, and they're having to look at policy afresh, because nobody has all of the answers policy-wise when you're introducing autonomous vehicles to your road system, or whether you're bringing in delivery drone or flying taxis. Are they going to go across existing airspace? And so there's a certain element that they've been forced to look at things from scratch and to develop policies and regulation before others Having said that, they've really grasped the nettle and moved forward with it. And there's a department or a unit that's set up in Dubai called Reg Lab, which is set up to fast track and accelerate the way that the UAE government develop policy for new technologies and work with stakeholders, global and local, with vendors and developers and R&D, et cetera, and work out how to bring in framework that allow the UAE to move forward with these new technologies at the pace that it wants to. So going back to what you mentioned on autonomous vehicles, famously, and I think this is widely publicized, Dubai is working with Cruise, General Motors Cruise unit in the US that develops and runs autonomous taxis. And they aim to have their first trial service run by the end of the year. And they're currently testing in some districts in Dubai, both how the vehicles work and also how the supporting technologies and road systems work.
I think it's interesting because they're not just doing the taxis as a nice to have on the side, but they want to make 25% of all the transportation trips in Dubai driverless by 2030. So imagine taking 25% of the drivers off the road. That's going to be fantastic for the traffic situation. But it just means that, it's a lot more efficient. If this works, they're talking about, I think it's 4,000 self-driving taxis by 2030. And that's the equivalent of one for every 1,000 people in the country. They're trying to integrate this into the whole economy, make it run on self-driving taxis and maybe flying taxis as well.
Yeah, and 4,000 taxis on the road in a mixed traffic scenario is a very bold ambition. And I think it's meant to be a stake in the ground. They want to prove that Dubai is pushing ahead, is at the leading edge of implementing these new smart city technologies, and it wants to realize the benefits. And of course, to do that, there's an awful lot of work involved. The regulatory side has been one side for sure. This is a big challenge, possibly even the greatest challenge that Dubai's made for itself in the transport arena. But Dubai's used to embracing new technologies and finding ways to use them, make them work. And don't forget, the Dubai Metro was the first driverless train system to be introduced to the Middle East. And that was a long time ago now. So the autonomous vehicles and the flying taxis, I'd say that probably inevitably plans have got to have changed somewhat over the last few years in looking at that. But the goal is ambitious and remains is 4,000 taxis on the road.
It's just fascinating, though, because the rest of the world, everybody's been doing their marketing trials of these things. So Singapore had an autonomous helicopter go up one day. You've seen them in Germany with the Volocopter. In Australia, they're always talking about the need for it, but they can't get around the whole regulation thing. It just seems like that once the Middle East, and UAE in particular, gets an idea, they run with it, but they figure out how to properly regulate it so it has that platform for growth. Because it's useless to sit there and just try and drive something and then come back and regulate it in the back end. They're putting policies in place so people know this is the environment we're going to go to and this is going to support the growth in these sectors.
Exactly. Put that in perspective, though, a lot of this new policy is in the form of frameworks. So they understand that the details of regulation are not all going to come at the same time, that it will involve a lot of debate and collaboration with operators, with technology vendors and developers, and through usage. So you have this new approach to policy where, as somebody mentioned regarding the metaverse regulation and policy last year, they set the North Star and then they work from there. And then the frameworks follow and the laws that delegate who's going to develop the detailed regulation and the detailed regulation follows. So there's still quite a lot to do on the regulatory front for autonomous vehicles, for example, although the development work started a long time ago, relatively in the last few years. And I wonder whether there will be significant regulation out there by the end of the year when they have the trial, but that wouldn't necessarily stop that trial. There's been, for example, a trial running in Abu Dhabi on and off for the last 2 years using autonomous vehicles on Yas Island and Taria Island, I believe. And now they're up to, I think, 10 robo-taxis and some buses. All of that and other pilots in the UAE are done with a special permission from the relevant government departments. So on the autonomous vehicle side, there's a lot that's been done. There's still a lot that's also due to come as well.
Thanks, Carrington. This is very exciting. And the regulatory frameworks, like you mentioned, I think this is really something that is done very well, setting the North Star, setting the vision, and trying to drive the right elements towards a framework and then allowing the ecosystem to develop around it. And what I really find exciting in the UAE and in Saudi in some ways is that governments are pushing the private sector a lot as well, right? So government-led initiatives allows the private sector to incubate and build the ecosystem around. And that's what's been fascinating me since I've been here, in how quickly the private sector is able to pull in the weight that is needed to drive it. So maybe a little bit on the government initiatives, both in Saudi. You talked about tourism. And by the way, as Nokia, we're very involved in providing network infrastructure into Saudi to NEOM and Line and others. So I think there is a lot of consumption of technology from a government standpoint. There's a lot of digital transformation initiatives. And specifically, I wanted to focus a bit, if you could, on how these government-led initiatives are allowing the incubation to happen in your view. And secondly, what do you believe the role for the government is in the talent pool? Because we talked about the number of labs that are around, and that's fascinating, and everyone's trying to get in and do the right things. There's a lot of training. But what role does the government have, especially in Saudi Arabia, which is a young country, to foster that talent into that direction where you're able to use all these technologies in the right way? So a few things in there. Would love your view on this government-led initiatives on both fronts.
This is certainly one of the things that stands out when you look at the progress made by Saudi Arabia and the UAE is the government has gone hands-on, and it has been very active throughout education ecosystem, through the economic sectors, through the different areas of government, and taking a very holistic approach to, okay, how will all of these pieces come together to create the future economy that we want? And in the UAE and Saudi, we've had these many education and talent initiatives, and they're aimed at school level, college level, at government workers in jobs in ministries and departments and authorities, at leadership, at executive level. And these programs are going on all the time. And in the UAE, we have the University of Artificial Intelligence have an ongoing executive program that basically aims to open the eyes of business sector and government executives on what AI can do for them and how they can harness AI and how they should plan for the future. And that's now, I think, going into the hundreds of people that have been through that program and now starting to bring people from outside the UAE as well. In the UAE, there's an annual summer camp that involves high school and college students, brings them together to focus on AI, where they can learn, find out about new education programs, careers, meet government officials that are actually involved in that work in ministries in the UAE, and help get them excited about technology and using technology to bring innovation. So you have these programs going through work and education in both the UAE and Saudi. And you also have government money that is going pretty much directly into building some of these new initiatives, institutions, flagship facilities in the industrial sector. Abu Dhabi, government's a big investor in R&D. In Saudi Arabia, over the past 18 months, we've seen a huge initiative from Saudi government to invest in and bring electric vehicle manufacturing to Saudi Arabia. And the first big headline news out of Saudi Arabia was Lucid last year, with the agreement to build a Lucid manufacturing plant in Saudi Arabia. And that resulted in the Saudi government facilitating $3.4 billion, I think it was, in finance for the factory, for fast-tracking production, for training Saudi nationals in the jobs and skills that they would need. And that was followed by several other announcements about electric vehicle manufacturing, including Saudi creating its own electric vehicle brand in Saudi Arabia called Tia. And so you put those together in a short space of time, the Saudi government has enabled a whole new production center in Saudi Arabia that will have an impact on high-tech jobs, that will have collaborations and so help grow the talent pool in terms of the specialized areas that they might need. It might be AI and analytics and robotics and other things. And organically, that might have taken a lot longer to happen had the Saudi government not been so bullish and dedicated the funding and the policy to make that happen.
It might not have happened at all, actually.
Exactly.
It is amazing. And we were talking about this a little bit to just close that off, that there is brute force, absolute brute force in trying to get these things done. And in fact, this electrical vehicle manufacturing could be a podcast on its own, because I was reading the other day, there's over 50 startups in electrical vehicle manufacturing in Europe and Middle East and Africa, where we're going to see a lot more in this space as well. Fascinating area.
I'm actually shocked that I'm going to say this, but I think the fact is, with regulation, they're driving innovation. And I'm old school. I grew up thinking if the government gets involved, and this is because I grew up in the US, government gets involved, it stifles innovation. But what we're seeing in some of the countries that are really at the forefront of things like artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, it's China and it's the Middle East. It's those countries that are basically just moving quicker than everybody else because maybe their governments aren't burdened with the same level of bureaucracy, just redesigning what they want it to be going forward. This regulation, it's not meant to stifle it. It's meant to promote the growth because you're giving people a target and they know what environment they're going into. The risk the rest of the world has in a lot of these things, whether it's AI or whether it's going to be autonomous vehicles, is if there's no regulation, you don't know what world you're going into yet. And I just think they're getting ahead of the game. And people should be watching this because this is where all the excitement is now. And what you're seeing is all the tech vendors, a lot of the VC funding, everyone's looking at the Middle East because it's just getting on with it and going ahead at such a fast rate.
Absolutely. And I'm consistently impressed with the holistic vision that the leadership in Saudi Arabia and in the UAE has. And it's not something that's obvious at first glance. All of these little pieces, all of these initiatives and all of these massive investments, they all fit together. They all help grow the talent pool, the investment, the number of commercial players, global and local, the number of opportunities for startups. And they're creating the excitement. One thing to round off on the electric vehicles, I think the Saudi Arabia now aims to be one of the world's biggest producers of electric vehicles, which really a couple of years ago would be almost preposterous to suggest. And I think I was reading that last year, the BMW is the biggest producer of electric vehicles in Germany, I think. And the amount of vehicles that they were going to produce in 1 year, Saudi will probably produce that number of vehicles in the next few years. It should get a giant leap. And how can that not be exciting?
It's almost like they've followed China's model with its 5-year plans, because when China does its 5-year plan, they align the supply and demand sides of the industry, but also the investment side and the regulatory side, and they stick the entire economy in one direction. They're basically doing this in the Middle East. They're all working together in a common direction. And I think it's fascinating to watch. And I'm dying to see how these self-driving taxis take off. I've seen the concept design they have for the Veloport, for the flying taxis. I hope this stuff comes off soon because if all else, the rest of the world needs to see it can be done. They'll learn from what's going on in the Middle East. And suddenly the Middle East is going to become the tech hub. It's going to become the central source for it going forward.
And next time you, Charles, is from Singapore, we're going to put you in a taxi, a self-driving taxi for sure from the airport.
I'm happy for a self-driving taxi. I'm not getting up in the air. I already have a fear of heights. So basically the idea of getting up into a flying taxi with no driver, no, that's not going to be me anytime in the near future. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's one of those things that has become a phenomena here. Even a few years ago, many people's reaction to, do you want the government involved, would be, no, stay away, stay out, leave it to the private sector. But we're now seeing success upon success that has been planned and facilitated by the government in a very specific way. And this region's always been a big buyer of technology. Going back to the 80s, there's an appetite to buy the latest technology, but the emphasis is on buy, not make. And I think this year, Saudi is going to spend over $40 billion on spending on technology in isolation. They're spending that on technology, but they're also changing the whole way that education works, that government policy works, that government interact and collaborate with data, that the way the economy is structured in terms of how the new 4IR and tech-enabled industrial sectors are going to grow blows your mind.
They're hitting the timing on this perfectly. Because if you look at it, the US is distracted with the recession. Europe's distracted with the recession. Asia's really slowed down with a combination of the impact from the pandemic, but then also because a lot of the MNCs here, they've just had a slowdown because of what's going on in the US and Europe, and they're getting held back. Suddenly, you've got a region that is almost every single country in that region is investing a ton in technology. So all of these firms now are starting to focus their resources and their innovation labs out in the Middle East. It's a great opportunity for them to take advantage of this going forward. And at the beginning of this podcast, you mentioned that you don't do your Asia AI news anymore. And I'm actually happy you don't, because it'd be a real struggle now to find enough interesting things every week to actually post. Whereas I get your newsletter on the Middle East news, and it's every week, my jaw's dropping. I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. How can they do all this stuff? So it's an exciting time. They've nailed the timing right, because they're now starting to get all the big vendors and the tech innovators to come out there and invest in it. They're getting the key players, the biggest tech brands, to come out there and invest heavily in the region. And that's going to really support not only the cities and the initiatives, but also build that next generation of talent.
And it's that commitment from the leadership here. I think it's very prominent of how the vision in UAE and Saudi Arabia on the tech front is being driven right from the top. So it is a fascinating time, and I'm glad that we're here to witness this together.
And it is very much the next generation is the focus. If you see all of these headline news of robo-taxis and flying taxis and what have you, this is still technology that is being bought and imported from global vendors. As you would expect, they buy from whoever's a leader in that field. But then alongside that, you have these efforts to innovate, create IP at home, encourage startups, local startups and global startups to come and develop their new offering in the UAE, for example, and this investment in R&D, where clearly there's a very strong directive to develop IP locally. And we're at the very early stages of that. As I mentioned, the Technology and Innovation Institute, that's less than 3 years old. And they've already got world-beating technology. Yesterday, I think Hugface, which is an open source site that ranked their models, released its new ranking to include the Falcom 40 billion parameter model from TII, and it ranked it first. And that above Facebook Llama, first in performance, first announced LLM model from the region is now ranked first.
That's impressive, because I saw an article 2 weeks ago that said if there was a ranking in this, that Falcom would probably rank in the top 5 globally. And now you're saying it's already coming across number 1 for performance.
Yeah. We've come a long way in a short space of time.
It's changing every week. And that's what I love about the Middle East, which is why we're doing this whole podcast series. There's just so much interesting innovation going on at such an incredible pace and supported by massive amounts of funding. We didn't even cover off like smart cities and the investments that are going in there, the hundreds of billions of dollars that are getting thrown into it. It's going to be a fascinating time for the Middle East right now.
Yes, it is. And then you've still got metaverse, virtual assets, blockchain, robotic, the defense sector, and the whole autonomous and unmanned vehicle area. All of these are also areas of opportunity.
Sounds like I should be maybe looking to move to the Middle East, because it's more exciting there right now than it is in Asia.
I think you should.
I just wanted to say thanks again, Carrington, for coming on. It's been a fascinating discussion. And Daniel, thanks so much for providing your insights as well on this. Carrington, I'm sure we'll love to have you back on again, because I don't think this is going to slow down anytime soon.
No, I think you're right. The one thing that is for sure is that it's going to keep going, keep getting more exciting. And there's a lot more announcements to come.
And if you want to keep track of those announcements, definitely follow Carrington's newsletter, Middle East AI News. You can find it on LinkedIn, and I'll be posting a link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, that's right.
Carrington, I think one of the next podcasts also need to be around telco, because I think there is a natural disruption happening in telco. Would love your opinions about that. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for sharing everything. And Charles, thank you for the opportunity to co-host here. It's been wonderful.
I mean, you guys know me a bit. My whole strategy for doing this podcast is that I'm incredibly selfish. I like learning about things I don't know about, and you guys are teaching me a lot about what is going on in the Middle East. So thank you guys both for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Daniel. It's been a blast, and I hope to do it again sometime.
I think we'll have to with the amount of announcements that are coming in. Thanks for joining us on this episode of the Tech Burst Asia podcast. If you liked the episode, please do click like and subscribe. And if you didn't, well, you probably didn't make it this far anyway. Talk to you next time on the next episode of the Tech Burst Asia podcast.